a crisp September afternoon in the year 1408, inside a stone church on the windswept fjords of southern Greenland, a young couple stood before an altar. Her name was Sigrid Bjornsdottir. His name was Torstein Olafsson. Outside the thick walls of Halsey Church, the cold Atlantic wind howled across the valley, but inside candles flickered, solemn Latin prayers were recited, and vows were exchanged before a room filled with local farmers, chieftains, and priests. A scribe recorded the event in careful, deliberate handwriting on parchment. He noted the date, the names of the witnesses, and the proclamation of marriage. That parchment was eventually packed onto a trading ship, carried across the churning North Atlantic, and filed away in official archives in Iceland. It is the single most haunting document in medieval history, because after that parchment was logged, the historical record goes completely dark. No more letters were sent to the Pope. No more trade manifests were recorded in Norway. No more ships arrived back in European ports, bearing tall tales from the northern edge of the earth. For the next 300 years, Europe simply forgot that nearly 3,000 Christian souls were living on the rim of the Arctic Ocean. When European explorers finally sailed back into those cold fjords in the early 1700s, fully expecting to reunite with the descendants of their long-lost Norse brethren, they braced themselves for a dramatic story. They expected to find the blackened ruins of a settlement destroyed by war, or perhaps the skeletal remains of a population wiped out by the Black Death. They expected a tragedy etched in fire and blood. Instead, they found absolute ghost towns. The thick stone walls of Halsey Church were still standing, open to the sky, but structurally sound. The farmsteads were empty, their oak doors gone, their hearths cold, but their foundations completely intact. There were no mass graves. There were no piles of unburied skeletons lying in the dirt with arrowheads lodged in their ribs. There were no scorched timbers left behind by an invading army. An entire European colony had simply ceased to exist, and they had done so without leaving behind a single trace of a final battle. For centuries, this mystery tormented historians, geologists, and adventurers. How does a society that survived on the brutal frontier of North America for over 400 years simply pack up and disappear from the face of the earth? The traditional answer was always violence. It was comfortable to blame bloodthirsty pirates from England, or fatal conflicts with the indigenous Thule people who moved into the region from the high Arctic. After all, these were the descendants of the Vikings. If they were gone, surely they must have met a violent, cinematic end, worthy of the sagas. But over the last few decades, modern archaeology, ice core sampling, and forensic science have systematically demolished that myth. What happened in Greenland wasn't a sudden, explosive catastrophe. It was something far more terrifying, far slower, and far more instructive for our own world. To understand how this society vanished, you have to go back to its beginning, and to the massive lie that brought them there in the first place. In the year 982, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Erik the Red, was banished from Iceland for 3 years, following a bloody feud that left several of his neighbors dead. With nowhere else to go, Erik sailed west into uncharted waters, chasing rumors of land seen by sailors tossed off course by North Atlantic storms. What he found was a towering wall of white ice and dark granite. But as he navigated around the southern tip of the giant landmass, he pushed his ship deep into protected inland fjords. There, sheltered from the crushing oceanic winds, he discovered something unexpected. Lush, green pockets of meadow grass, birch scrub, and fertile valleys that looked surprisingly like home. When his 3-year exile expired, Eric returned to Iceland with a grand proposition. Iceland was overcrowded, stripped of its timber, and suffering from a severe shortage of good farmland. Eric told the land-starved farmers that he had found a paradise across the ocean. And to make it sound as appealing as possible, he gave this harsh, frozen land a brilliant piece of marketing copy. He named it Greenland. It worked. In the summer of 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships packed with families, timber, tools, and livestock westward into the icy unknown. 11 ships were lost or turned back due to ferocious storms, but 14 made it to shore. They carved out 2 major territories along the southwestern coast: the Eastern Settlement, situated near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the smaller Western Settlement, hundreds of miles to the north, near modern-day Nuuk. These were not primitive outposts. Within a few generations, the Norse of Greenland had built a thriving, sophisticated society. They constructed massive stone cathedrals with stained glass windows imported from Europe. They built a bishop's estate at Gardar, complete with a grand dining hall and complex irrigation systems. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, grazing them on the delicate Arctic pastures during the brief, intense summer months. And they paid their tithes to the Vatican, not in gold, but in the ultimate luxury goods of the medieval world: Arctic fox furs, live polar bear cubs for European monarchs, and above all, walrus ivory. Walrus ivory was the white gold of medieval Europe. Craved by royalty and religious elite for delicate carvings, croziers, and chess sets, Greenland held a near monopoly on its supply. Every summer, brave bands of Norse hunters would sail hundreds of miles north into the treacherous, ice-choked waters of Disco Bay to hunt these massive beasts, hauling tons of tusks back south to trade with European merchant ships. For nearly 4 centuries, the system worked. The Greenlanders were connected to the grand trade networks of Europe. They dressed in the latest European fashions, drank imported French wine, and viewed themselves as proud, civilized Christians living on the edge of the world. They believed their way of life was permanent. They believed the mountains, the grass, and the weather would always sustain them. They were wrong. By the early 1300s, subtle changes began to ripple through the atmosphere. The unusually warm climate streak that had allowed Eric the Red to farm in Greenland was coming to an abrupt end. The sun began to feel a little weaker. The summers grew shorter, colder, and wetter. The winters grew mercilessly long. Across the globe, the Little Ice Age was setting in. As the ice sheets expanded, massive icebergs began to break off into the ocean, choking the shipping lanes that connected Greenland to Norway and Iceland. The summer grass harvest began to shrink, making it harder and harder to feed cattle through the winter. And then, the hunters in the northern fjords noticed something else. Out on the water, long, skin-covered kayaks were cutting through the ice. The Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, were migrating south, tracking the seals and whales that thrived in the expanding cold. 2 completely different cultures, with 2 radically different ways of surviving the Arctic, were about to collide on an increasingly frozen landscape. For decades, early historians assumed this meeting of worlds triggered a bloody, total war. They pointed to dark tales in Icelandic sagas describing Skrælingjar, the Norse word for the native Arctic peoples, and imagined violent clashes over hunting grounds. Yet modern digs reveal a far more nuanced and far stranger relationship. Archaeologists digging through ancient Thule winter houses have uncovered Norse iron rivets, woven wool scraps, and carved wooden figurines depicting men in long European coats. The 2 groups were trading. They knew each other. The real tragedy wasn't that the Thule attacked the Norse. It was that the Thule possessed the keys to survival, and the Norse were too rigid to take them. The Thule had spent millennia mastering the high Arctic. They wore tailored seal fur garments that trapped body heat and repelled water. They hunted ringed seals through breathing holes in the winter ice, built swift skin kayaks that could brave choppy fjords, and traveled vast distances using dog sleds. They treated the frozen landscape not as an enemy, but as their home. The Norse, on the other hand, were stubbornly Scandinavian. They viewed themselves as proud European farmers, subject to the King of Norway and the laws of the Catholic Church. Even as the ice sheets crept down the mountains and the glaciers choked the valleys, they refused to adopt Inuit clothing or hunting gear. Instead, they kept wearing high-fashion European tunics made of coarse wool that soaked up freezing water. They continued building massive, drafty stone halls that required enormous amounts of scarce wood to heat. And above all, they clung to their livestock. To a Norse chief, prestige wasn't measured in seals or polar bear hides. It was measured in cows. But a single dairy cow requires a staggering amount of winter fodder to survive 6 months locked inside a dark stone barn. As the Little Ice Age squeezed the region, the short summer growing season shortened even further. The grass crops shrank. Soil erosion, caused by overgrazing the fragile Arctic turf, stripped the topsoil from the valleys. The farmers were forced to make agonizing choices. To save their precious cows, they fed them seaweed and twigs. When those ran out, they slaughtered the herds. Forensic analysis of cattle bones from the final layers of Norse settlements shows animals so malnourished their hooves had rotted, their bones paper-thin. Yet, despite this ecological nightmare, the colony might have held on if they could still rely on their greatest lifeline to the outside world, the ivory trade. Then, in the mid-1300s, the international economy dealt Greenland a knockout blow. Crucial trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East reopened, flooding European markets with elephant ivory. Elephant ivory was larger, softer, easier to carve, and far more luxurious than the tough, brittle tusks of the North Atlantic walrus. Almost overnight, the market value of walrus ivory collapsed. To make matters worse, the ocean itself was turning hostile. As the polar ice cap expanded, vast fields of drift ice swept down the eastern coast of Greenland, turning the Atlantic shipping lanes into a death trap. Merchant vessels from Norway, already battered by the arrival of the Black Death in 1349, which decimated Scandinavia's population and fleet, simply stopped coming. Greenland was cut loose. The supply of iron tools, timber, grain, and church wine trickled down to nothing. Deprived of trade, facing ruined pastures, and trapped on a freezing coast, the Norse did something remarkable. They tried to change. For a long time, scholars believed the Norse were too arrogant to alter their diet, choosing to starve rather than eat fish or seal. But chemical analysis of human skeletons buried in Greenland's churchyards tells a brilliant, tragic story. When scientists measured the carbon isotopes in the bones of early 11th century settlers, they found that nearly 80% of their diet came from farm animals and land plants. But when they tested the skeletons from the late 14th century, the ratio had completely flipped. Up to 80% of their food was coming from the ocean, primarily seal meat. They had adapted. They had become sea hunters. They had fought with everything they had to feed their communities alive. It just wasn't enough. Around the year 1350, the crisis claimed its first major victim, the Western settlement. Deep inside the northern fjords, the smaller, more isolated community was struggling under the brutal cold. Word reached the larger eastern settlement in the south that something was terribly wrong in the north. A priest named Ivar Barderson was dispatched with a small armed force to investigate and lend assistance. Barderson spent days rowing his ship north through misty, ice-filled waters, bracing for what he assumed would be a scene of carnage, perhaps a settlement under siege or a town ravaged by disease. When his boat finally glided into the shores of the western settlement, he stepped out into a terrifying stillness. There were no bodies. There were no burning buildings. There were no signs of fight or plunder. The homes were standing empty. The church doors swung gently on their hinges. In the fields and stone pens, a few forgotten sheep and cattle roamed wild, grazing on the brown grass. Every single human being in the northern colony, hundreds of men, women, and children, had completely vanished into thin air. Barderson and his men searched house after house, calling out into the cold wind, but the only sound was the echo of their own voices. They gathered what livestock they could carry, loaded them onto their ship, and rowed back south, bearing news that struck terror into the hearts of everyone left in the eastern settlement. The north was gone. The wilderness was closing in. And now, the survivors in the south were completely alone. As the late 1300s bled into the 1400s, the social fabric of the remaining settlement began to fray at the edges. With no ships coming from Europe, there were no new iron knives, no church officials, no news from home. The young people looked around at their dwindling herds, their falling stone walls, and the endless ice encroaching on the mountains. They realized that the world their ancestors built was dying. They could see it in the rising ocean waters creeping over their coastal meadows. As the massive Greenland ice sheet expanded during the Little Ice Age, its immense weight actually dragged the surrounding sea toward the coastline, raising local water levels by up to 11 feet. The precious low-lying pastures that had fed their livestock for 4 centuries were slowly drowned in freezing salt water. Faced with flooded fields, collapsing trade, and relentless Arctic cold, the residents of the eastern settlement made a decision that challenges almost every myth ever told about the Vikings. They did not go down fighting in a grand, catastrophic battle. They did not sit in their homes and starve to death, waiting for a miracle. Instead, they packed up and left. For decades, archaeologists wondered why so few valuable items were found in the ruins of Greenland's farmsteads. In thousands of excavated rooms, researchers found almost no iron tools, no bronze kettles, no silver brooches, and no precious church relics. Even the heavy wooden roof beams, oak doors, and iron door hinges had been carefully unbolted and taken. If an invading army had sacked these villages, or if a sudden plague had wiped out the population, those precious items would have been left lying in the dirt. The fact that they are missing tells us everything we need to know. The disappearance of Greenland's Norse colony wasn't a slaughter. It was a quiet, deliberate, and orderly evacuation. Starting in the early 1400s, as small trading vessels occasionally managed to pick their way through the sea ice, families began purchasing passage back across the ocean. They gathered their children, their iron knives, and their ancestral heirlooms, bade a final farewell to the graves of their forebears, and boarded ships bound for Iceland and Norway. They didn't vanish into thin air. They simply went back to where their ancestors came from, quietly integrating back into the broader Scandinavian world. With every departure, the remaining community grew smaller and more vulnerable. The labor force shrank. It became harder to maintain the massive stone churches, harvest enough winter feed, or round up the remaining livestock. Eventually, only a handful of elders and stubborn families remained in the quiet valleys of the south. And then, sometime in the mid to late 15th century, the very last boat pushed off from the shore, leaving the fjords empty. When the Danish-Norwegian missionary Hans Egede arrived in Greenland in 1721, determined to bring the Protestant Reformation to the lost medieval colony, he sailed into a ghost landscape. He found no lost Christians. He found only the local Inuit, who led him through the birch scrub to ancient moss-covered stone walls. Egede walked through the empty nave of Falsey Church, stepping over thick turf where generations of settlers had once knelt in prayer. The roof had fallen, but the granite walls stood as straight and sturdy as the day they were laid over 300 years before. The great mystery that stumped historians for centuries wasn't solved by discovering a hidden battlefield or a mass grave. It was solved by listening to the quiet evidence of climate, economics, and human resilience. The Norse of Greenland were not reckless fools, nor were they helpless victims. They were remarkably resilient people who survived for 4 centuries on the absolute edge of the known world. They adapted their diet, hunted across ice sheets, and built a European community where few believed human life was possible. But their downfall carries a sobering lesson for our own modern world. Their colony was built on an unsustainable luxury trade, dependent on distant global markets, and anchored in the false assumption that the climate around them would remain forever predictable. When the weather shifted, the ocean rose, and trade routes collapsed, their social system reached a breaking point. Their story isn't a saga of defeat and war. It is a story about the fragile boundary between human society and the natural world, a reminder that no civilization, no matter how tough or proud, is immune to the changing of the earth. The stone walls of Valsey still stand today on the cold, windswept shore, looking out across the icy water, a quiet monument to a people who didn't lose a final war, but simply ran out of time. If this journey into one of history's greatest vanishing acts fascinated you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. What do you think was the biggest factor in the fall of the Norse colony? The shifting climate, the economic collapse, or the rising seas? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what historical mystery we should explore next.